How does illegal immigration fit into Catholic teaching? This is a complex issue and it has many different aspects to consider. In this video, I'm going to cover 5 aspects of this problem that I think are pertinent. The first aspect is the Church's moral teaching regarding the need for rich nations to welcome foreigners. In the Catechism of the Catholic Church, under the teaching for the Fourth Commandment, it reads, 2241 The more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. Public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. Political authorities, for the sake of the common good for which they are responsible, may make the exercise of the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrant's duties toward their country of adoption. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying civic burdens. Within the Church's teaching on the Seventh Commandment, we should also realize that the Church has always taught that the rich are morally obliged to use what God has given to them in order to help the poor who need their help. This is true for individuals, for companies, and for entire nations. The universal destination of goods means that all things were created for all people, and therefore, although we divide territory between different nations, in truth, what has been created is still ultimately intended for all. The story of the rich man and Lazarus in the Gospel is also worth noting here. The rich man fails to help Lazarus, who suffers at his doorstep every day, and in the end, when they die, their situations are reversed and God's judgment falls upon the rich man for failing to help Lazarus. There are many refugees and people trying to escape dire poverty who are trying to come to the richer nations of the world in order to find the safety and livelihood that they couldn't find in the places they came from. These people on the doorsteps of the rich nations of the world are perhaps like Lazarus at the doorsteps of the rich man's house. Rich nations have a grave obligation to help these people. There are 2 points I first want to highlight within the text of the Catechism at the moment. The first is that it says that political authorities are allowed to make conditions to immigration, provided that those conditions are serving the common good. Nations are allowed to put conditions on immigration. However, if the conditions result in people who need help being unable to get it, this can be problematic. It is not serving the common good if the conditions you place on migration are preventing people who desperately need help from coming to your country. Think back on the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Suppose that the rich man said that he would be willing to help Lazarus, but only after Lazarus went through a 2-year screening process, demonstrated his educational credentials, got letters of reference from previous people he worked for, and then was able to pass a test showing his understanding of the Jewish law. And only once Lazarus did all these things, then the rich man might open up his heart to let Lazarus stay in his home rather than on the street every day in front of his house. And then suppose that Lazarus couldn't meet these conditions, and therefore he remained outside. Could the rich man then say, I can't be judged anymore, because I offer my hand to help Lazarus, and he wasn't able to fulfill the demands that would have allowed him to get my help? When the rich man and Lazarus dies, will the rich man then get to join Lazarus in Abraham's bosom because of this offer to help Lazarus if Lazarus fulfilled some impossible conditions? A concept here that we need to understand is that the duty to find a way to bring help to the poor is something that falls on the rich far more than it falls on the poor. It is not that the poor have something to fear because they didn't get help from the rich, but it is rather the rich that have to fear the judgment if they fail to bring help to the poor. If you are wealthy and there are people who need your help, finding a way to help them is really your problem to solve. It is not their problem to figure out how to convince you to help them. While it can be legitimate to establish conditions for someone to receive your help, when you are able to help them, if your establishment of those conditions means that those who need your help are not going to receive it, then this is something that you need to worry about. You will be judged in the end on how you treated those least among you, and if you did not help these people when you could in this life now, then you may be punished for it when you meet God at the final judgment. Rich nations, when confronted with refugees and migrants trying to escape from extreme poverty, sometimes place conditions on entry that essentially prevent many people who desperately need help from receiving that help. They still leave Lazarus at their doorstep in the final analysis, even though they theoretically provided legitimate routes that Lazarus could use to enter their house. Rich nations can put conditions on immigration, but only if those conditions serve the common good. The second point in the text from the Catechism I want to highlight here is that this text doesn't say that the rich nations are obliged to welcome everyone. The text rather says to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. In other words, it is referring to people who have left their homeland because they can't find safety or a means of livelihood in their homes. It is not referring to people who have safety or a livelihood in their home countries. A huge number of people who attempt to immigrate to rich nations are then not being covered by what this text is saying. People who are fleeing from wars, famines, natural disasters. People who are trying to escape from extreme poverty and can't find a way to live a life of dignity in their home countries. These are the people that rich nations have an obligation to help. The rich man should allow Lazarus to enter his home. He is not morally obligated to allow everyone to enter his home. Looking at this issue, we have to divide immigrants first into two groups. The first group are those who need to immigrate because of extreme circumstances that prevent them from having safety or having their basic needs met in their home country. The second group are all those who chose to immigrate, but they can get safety and a livelihood in their home country. Rich nations can and do allow people from the second group to enter as well, but in this case, it is not a moral imperative for them to do so. The rich man doesn't need to help the stranger who is doing fine on his own. Rather, it is Lazarus that he has the obligation to assist. This is the teaching of the Church on the duties of rich nations to accept immigrants. There are people who may claim that there is such a thing as a universal right to migration, which means that nations must accept anyone who wishes to come to their country. However, this is not the doctrine of the Universal Church. When talking about the subject of illegal immigration, we have to realize that illegal immigrants include people in both categories. But the Church only teaches that rich nations are obligated to assist the former group, not the latter. When people illegally enter and reside in a country, there is then a need for the authorities to discern which group these people belong to. If illegal immigrants belong to the first group, then if the authorities deport them, they may essentially be telling Lazarus to go back onto the street again. This doesn't serve the common good because these people need help and you are refusing to help them. However, if illegal immigrants belong to the second group, this argument doesn't apply. If these people are able to be safe and find a livelihood in their home country, then the rich nation can deport them without contradicting the Church's teaching, since the Church only requires that rich nations help those who actually need help. Whether or not it is wise to deport them is a different issue. There may be good reasons for why it would be good to keep them and not deport them. But regarding this second group of illegal immigrants, there is no critical requirement in Church teaching that says that it would be wrong for countries to deport these people after they have illegally entered or resided in the country. The teaching of the universal destination of goods within Catholic theology holds the idea that all things are ultimately intended for all people. This includes land as well. However, this doesn't mean that nations must allow for anyone who wishes to enter to come in, any more than it means that you must allow anyone who wants your property to take it or use it. The universal destination of goods is a higher truth behind property rights, but it doesn't in itself cancel private property or the moral need for people to respect the property of others. In the same way, it also doesn't cancel the right for nations to control borders or to refuse entry to people. Some Catholics have also alleged that deportation itself is immoral, pointing to a part of the Vatican II document Gaudium et Spes, which reads as follows. Furthermore, whatever is opposed to life itself, such as any type of murder, genocide, abortion, euthanasia, or willful self-destruction, whatever violates the integrity of the human person, such as mutilation, torments inflicted on body or mind, attempts to coerce the will itself, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit, rather than as free and responsible persons. All these things and others of their like are infamies indeed. They read this document as saying that the Church condemns all deportations, no matter the circumstances. Following this interpretation, it would seem to mean that any form of forcing a person to move from one place to another against their will is a violation of human dignity. Any extradition of a criminal, any deportation for whatever reason, any time you convict a criminal and send him to a prison outside his hometown, every time you build a hydro dam and have to move people out of the floodplain, etc., are all violations of human dignity that must be condemned. This is probably not what the document intended to mean, however. Natural law and logic wouldn't really seem to support what the church would be alleging to be God's law in that case. A more likely reading is that the list in that document is referring to those examples which are insulting to human dignity. In other words, when deportations violate human dignity, then they must be condemned in that case, but not in other cases. If we took another example from the list, mutilation, this is not a violation of the integrity of the human person if it is being done in certain contexts. For example, for serious medical reasons, it is permissible to cut off a limb. In the Old Covenant, Jews were commanded by God to circumcise their foreskin. During a war, a soldier who is defending his country and who throws a grenade that ends up mutilating the body of an enemy soldier is also not necessarily guilty of evil. We can understand that mutilation is an evil only within certain contexts, and not in every context. Similarly, deportation can be a violation of human dignity, but it is not necessarily a violation of human dignity. When are deportations violating human dignity, and when are they not? I think the answer is that when the deportation is being done to a person who has a right to stay in a place, then it may be a violation of human dignity. For example, during a war, a country forcibly deports a population of people from their homeland in order to ethnically cleanse a region. On the other hand, if you are deporting someone who has no right to remain in this place, such as if the person entered the country illegally or someone who refuses to live peacefully in the society, this is not necessarily a violation of human dignity. That is the first aspect I want to touch on for this issue. The second aspect I want to touch on is the relationship between church and state with regard to this issue. In some countries, the local church has been very vocal in its support for the rights of illegal immigrants, even to the point of attacking public legislation or policy directions of governments that want to crack down on illegal immigrants. The church has a role to speak about moral issues. The Catechism says this. 2246, it is a part of the church's mission to pass moral judgments even in matters related to politics, whenever the fundamental rights of man or the salvation of souls requires it. The only means, she may use are those which are in accord with the gospel and the welfare of all men according to the diversity of times and circumstances. The church is not a political institution. Its mission is to teach the gospel, so that through belief and obedience to the gospel, the human race can find salvation. Moral issues are not limited to just personal choices, however, but every decision people make, both as individuals and as larger communities, always has moral dimensions. I could perhaps explain it like this. All people are required to obey the gospel in order to find eternal life. Within the category of all people, this also includes voters, government officials, and political leaders. The church doesn't dictate to political leaders how they should run their countries, but it does teach moral truths that those political leaders need to follow, just like how all people need to follow, in order to find eternal life. It is not that the church should run the state, but it's rather that the people who do run the state need to follow the things that the church teaches when they run the state. A local parish priest has a right and a duty to speak out against the moral vices of those who are part of his community. Similarly, a bishop or a pope has a right and a duty to speak out when political leaders or entire countries are disregarding the moral law. The bishops have a right and a duty, therefore, to speak out on the issue of illegal immigration when they see some moral failing occurring in relation to this issue. If they think that the country is acting like the rich man and leaving Lazarus at their doorstep, then it is their duty as pastors of souls to warn them about what they are doing. However, again, there's a limit to this authority which we need to identify here. The bishops have a duty to speak out on moral issues. The Holy Spirit granted to them through ordination gives them a power and an authority to speak out on such issues. However, they don't have a duty to speak out on what I'm going to call technical issues or practical issues. The Spirit gives them the authority to pass judgments on what is morally right and what is morally wrong. but the Spirit does not give them the authority to pass judgments on other fields of knowledge. Bishops don't have a special power to tell people what is historically true or historically false. They don't have a special power to tell people what is scientifically true or scientifically false. They don't have any special authority that lets them pass judgment on all sorts of human knowledge, whether it be economics, geography, mathematics, social sciences, linguistics, etc. Only when those fields of knowledge are directly touching something that the Church holds as a belief of the faith, then the bishops have a right to pass judgments on them. For example, if historians claim that Jesus was not a historical person, bishops then have a right to refute them, because believing that Christ was real is a core tenet of the faith. But if historians instead claim that Socrates was not a real person, bishops don't carry an authority to refute them, since this is ultimately a question that relates to human knowledge apart from the faith. With regard to passing judgments on politics, the same is true here. Bishops have a right and a duty to pass judgments on moral questions relating to politics. However, they don't have such rights or duties to pass judgments on technical or practical aspects relating to politics. I will give some examples. The Church teaches that capital punishment is immoral. Therefore, if countries use capital punishment, the bishops have a right and a duty to speak out against it. If they wish, the bishops could even excommunicate or refuse communion to politicians who publicly reject the Church's moral teaching on this subject. Now let us take another example. The Universal Church doesn't teach whether or not minimum wage legislation benefits poor workers. Catholic social teaching has a concept called a just wage, which means that every worker should be paid what he needs to live in dignity. However, whether or not minimum wage legislation is effective practically at achieving a just wage is something that the Church has no power to teach. It doesn't teach this because this is now a technical question and not simply a moral question. For example, some economists may argue that minimum wage helps workers by making sure that they are paid enough to live. However, other economists might argue that minimum wage legislation actually causes companies to hire fewer workers or makes them seek to outsource more jobs to regions of the world that don't have minimum wage. People can still believe in the Church's teaching that governments should work to protect the common good and defend the poor workers, while at the same time, they may hold different views among them about whether from a technical perspective this specific legislation ultimately harms or benefits these workers. Every political issue has both technical and moral dimensions to it. But the bishops only have authority to judge the moral dimensions, not the technical dimensions. They can tell people that the state should protect the common good, but they don't really have the power to tell people whether law X or policy Y is effective from a technical perspective at serving the common good. Some political debates are revolving around the moral dimensions only, and the bishops have every right to step in and declare which side is right and which side is wrong. For example, no one is really questioning the technical dimensions of capital punishment. There is no one really doubting from a technical perspective whether capital punishment is effective at putting people to death. The argument for that issue is rather only for the moral dimensions, about whether or not it is right to put someone to death. But for most political issues, people can reasonably debate the technical issues, and the bishops should be cautious about wading too deeply into those debates, because they may end up passing judgments on things that they don't really have an authority to pass judgments about. People can believe that the Church teaching is true, that the state should protect the common good and safeguard human rights, while at the same time disagree among themselves about how the money is spent, how taxes are levied, how regulations are set, etc., simply because they disagree about what the actual practical effects of those policies would be. When the disagreement is about whether or not a piece of legislation or a policy will achieve a particular result practically, the Church doesn't really have a role in passing judgments. But when the disagreement is about whether or not something is right or wrong morally, then the Church needs to speak. Immigration policy is the same. Bishops need to speak out when there are people who need help and are not getting it, or when human rights are being violated, because those are moral dimensions of political issues. They should pass judgments when they see things in proposed legislation or policy that appears to be in contradiction with the moral law. However, this authority does not carry over into the technical dimensions of the illegal immigration debate. People can disagree with each other from a technical perspective about whether or not policy X or legislation Y will actually produce a result that harms the human rights of illegal immigrants. The church teaching only tells them that they must work to uphold those human rights and strive for the common good. When bishops make judgments on moral issues in politics, we should perhaps look at them as though they were if statements. If policy X will produce Y negative result, then our duty to uphold the common good requires us not to adopt it. If burning fossil fuels produces global warming and environmental catastrophe, then we should seek to solve this problem. If vaccines are effective at preventing disease, then people should use them. The thing is that those first if statements are relying on certain technical facts to be true. These facts are not things that bishops hold authority to pass judgments over. That isn't to say that they are not true. It is just that Catholic teaching doesn't bind people to believe in certain kinds of secular opinions. Different people can hold different views on those technical dimensions of political issues, and at the same time, they can still be in full obedience to the moral teaching of the Church. Does that mean that bishops should not speak about political issues when they are relying on secular facts to first be true in order to make those moral judgments? I don't think so, because I think they would never speak about moral issues ever again in that case. Whenever they pass judgments on moral issues, they are always relying on an assumption that certain technical facts are true before they make such judgments. I think bishops should keep speaking even if they are sometimes indirectly judging that one side in a secular debate about secular knowledge is right and the other is wrong when they wade into these arguments. However, from the perspective of the political leaders themselves, the voters and the laity in general, if we understand this, then we can also realize that we don't necessarily need to agree with the bishops when they pass such judgments either. Because while we generally shouldn't be disagreeing with them about moral judgments, we can legitimately disagree with them about technical judgments. And if the specific moral judgment requires a particular technical judgment to be true, then as long as we hold a different view on the technical judgment, we are not bound to follow the moral judgment either. People can disagree about whether using military to enforce immigration policy will actually produce human rights violations from a technical perspective, but they must agree that human rights violations should be avoided. People can disagree about whether mass deportations will actually cause people who need help to fail to get it, but they must agree that people who need help should be helped. People can disagree about whether people who have spent decades in their country would actually be able to readapt if they were sent back home. But they must agree that the rights of every person to have their own livelihood should be respected. In the broken windows theory in criminology, the theory holds that when you visibly crack down on publicly visible disobedience to laws, you end up also eliminating many other crimes too, and help build an environment where people care more about the rules. Following that theory, one could argue that not punishing masses of illegal immigrants in your territory will also cause many people in that place to disregard other laws and to feel that laws in general don't really matter. If people see that all of these people enter the country illegally and nothing is done about it, people may then ask, well, why do I have to obey the speed limits? Why do I have to honestly report my taxes? Why do I have to follow public health regulations? The place that the rule of law itself holds in the minds of people can also suffer if they think that the authorities are being selective in which laws they choose to enforce. In other words, if you don't deport them according to that logic, you will end up harming the common good. People can hold different opinions about whether that theory is true at all or whether it applies in that case. They may argue that the broken windows theory is bad criminology and has many reasons for why it is factually inaccurate. But my point is that as long as it is possible for reasonable people to have that disagreement on what is ultimately a technical point in secular knowledge and not a moral point, then we can't really say that people are necessarily not following church teaching when they think that illegal immigration needs to be treated more harshly. The church exists to teach the moral dimensions. It is up to the laity to then decide in their own conscience about what particular actions are most conducive to following those moral teachings. The third aspect I want to cover is one that I feel is extremely pertinent to this entire debate, and yet I find it so perplexing how it is that it seems to be so frequently ignored. There is an aspect of Catholic teaching that is in the Gospel and in the letters of the apostles, and which has been reaffirmed by the magisterium down the centuries, which is speaking directly to this issue. This is the duty of Catholics to obey and submit themselves to the civil authorities. In the Gospel, Christ said to give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he wrote that we must submit to the authorities, and he who resists the authorities is resisting God, because they are God's servants. The Catechism teaches that Christians should obey the laws of the country that they reside. Even the piece of the Catechism I quoted earlier says this. Immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them, to obey its laws, and to assist in carrying civic burdens. It literally says in the text that immigrants are obliged to obey the laws of the state. Immigration laws are also laws. Catholic teaching tells us that people are obliged by conscience to obey the laws of the place that they live in. Deliberately breaking the law of the state may in fact be a sin in God's eyes. This isn't an absolute imperative. There are some actions that are sinful in every circumstance, regardless of the conditions. For example, fornication or blasphemy can never be legitimate no matter what environment the action occurred within. However, with regard to obedience to the civil authorities, there are examples when it is legitimate to disobey. If the law of the state requires you to do something that is contrary to the gospel or contrary to the law of God, then you cannot follow the law of the state. Furthermore, if the law of the state is preventing human rights from being upheld, then it is no longer obligatory to follow those particular laws. This commandment, however, does compel Catholics to obey the immigration laws of the states where they reside. Catholics shouldn't overstay their visas. They shouldn't cross borders illegally. Catholics need to submit to the public authorities as a matter of conscience. Now, in the case of those people who belong to that first group I identified earlier, who are immigrating because of dire need, they may perhaps have an excuse that allows them to disobey the immigration laws and illegally immigrate. I say perhaps because this exception itself has conditions. If someone is starving and has no food, it may be legitimate to steal a loaf of bread. However, while this is true on paper, the argument is also assuming that the thief isn't able to get the loaf of bread through some legitimate way. If he can get the bread by begging, by working, by doing something other than stealing, then stealing is no longer morally acceptable. It is only if those other options are not available, then stealing becomes licit for him subjectively. Similarly, if the person trying to escape extreme conditions in his home country can reasonably find some legitimate way to migrate, then he needs to do that first before he illegally immigrates. If he can leave his home and go somewhere else that legally accepts him, and in this place he can escape from the dire situation he was in before, then he no longer has an exception to the commandment that would allow him to illegally cross the borders into a nation that wouldn't legally accept him. Only for those people who really have no other choice except to illegally immigrate, or else their human rights will not be upheld, do they get an exception that allows them to disobey the civil authorities without sin. This is true for the first group, but for the second group I identified earlier, who are people who can find safety or a livelihood in their home country, they're violating the commandment to obey the civil authorities when they cross borders illegally or deliberately stay past their visa's expiration. This is something that should bind the consciences of people. If you are a Catholic and you are illegally staying in another country, you should voluntarily return back to your country, unless it is impossible for you to do so without grave harm resulting. Even if you are not arrested by immigration authorities and you seem to be safe where you are, the commandment of God is that you should still follow the civil authorities as a matter of conscience. Perhaps you will have less money or a lower standard of living when you go back. Perhaps now you make a six-figure salary, but back home, you could only work as a common farm laborer. But so what? Sacrifice some things in this life in order to follow the commandments of God, and you will have treasure in heaven. Immigrating to heaven is far more important than immigrating to America or Europe. Disobeying public authorities when people are able to comply with them is not just a matter of breaking the human law, but it is actually a sin. I can't understand why this is mentioned so rarely in this debate, but it needs to be called out and taught publicly, just as the church has a responsibility to speak on all moral issues in the society. The fourth aspect I want to cover here, relating to this debate, relates to the virtue of justice. The four cardinal virtues in the church's tradition are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. The virtue of justice carries the principle that people ultimately are equal. No person is more important than another person, and politics or laws should work with that principle in mind. One person should not get special treatment over anyone else, because this is opposed to the virtue of justice. Think of this example. Suppose you had a theme park and there was a long line to get into the theme park because the management only let in a certain number of people at a time. People needed to wait in this line for hours in the hot sun before they could enter the park, but these people followed the rules and kept their place in line, patiently waiting for their turn. Now, then suppose that some people didn't want to wait in line, so they hopped over the fence and entered the theme park this way. The management then caught these people after they had already been there for a few hours, but because they had already been there for so long and had bought tickets to many of the rides, they decided to just let them stay. Would this be fair to all those people who had to wait in line in order to get into the park? These people who broke into the park get to stay. Would this be fair to all those people who had to wait in line in order to get into the park? These people who broke into the park get to stay, but all those people who followed the rules have to wait longer before they are allowed in. In this example, one could even say that the management is undermining their own rules when they do this, and encouraging more people to break the rules rather than patiently wait in line. Now think about the realities surrounding illegal immigration. There are huge numbers of people in the developing world that would love, perhaps even dream of the chance that they could live in one of the more developed nations in the West. And some of these people apply legally for immigration and they get denied, and their lifelong dreams of immigrating never become true. How is it fair that all of these people who never broke the rules and kept within their own country are not permitted to immigrate, but the people who broke the rules and illegally immigrated should be allowed to stay? If you legalize these people after they cross the border illegally, then how is it fair that you still don't allow the person who never broke the rules to come in? People who illegally immigrate should not get more favorable treatment than the people who respected your rules and remained in their own country after you denied them their applications. Unless you are going to allow all of those people who respected your denial to come and immigrate, how could it be fair to legalize the status of people who didn't respect your rules and came anyways? Justice demands that one person is not treated more favorably than another. I think that in this example, there are perhaps only two options that governments can employ. 1. Deport all of the illegal immigrants, except for those who cannot return because of dire circumstances, and don't let them have something that those who respected the rules were denied. Or 2. All of those people who applied to immigrate and were denied for reasons other than something very grave should all be allowed to come and stay if those who illegally entered are allowed to stay. Another issue relating to the virtue of justice is a lesser one, but it is worth pointing out here. Some Western governments receive a lot of criticism because of policies to stop migrants or deport them. However, in truth, there are other governments of wealthy nations in the world that are far more restrictive and intolerant towards migrants, including both those who need help and those who wish to immigrate for other reasons. The wealthy oil states of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries and the wealthy countries in East Asia accept very few refugees. In the case of the wealthy Arab countries, even when the refugees speak the same language and share the same religion, they will still close their doors to them. Why is it, however, that sometimes it seems to me that there is a very different standard applied when judging these countries in comparison to the criticism lodged against some of the Western countries? The Western countries that are trying to crack down on illegal immigration are nowhere near the level of strictness that these countries have against illegal immigration. Japan has had one of the highest death rates for illegal migrants in detention of any country in the developed world. South Korea has around 1% of the number of settled refugees that Spain has, even though South Korea has a larger GDP than Spain and is actually experiencing a demographic crisis. In Saudi Arabia, border guards have reportedly used bullets and military explosives to kill illegal migrants crossing the border, including women and children at close range. Justice requires that you apply the same standard for similar cases. If wealthy countries in the West are condemned for deporting illegal immigrants, then surely these wealthy countries in the East are far worse for giving no chance for most migrants to ever stay in their countries to begin with. On the other hand, if we avoid judging these wealthy countries in the East and give them deferential respect to their cultures and how they organize their laws, then why are we still passing judgment on the decisions made by political leaders in the West? The virtue of justice requires a fair standard to be applied when judging. The fifth aspect I want to cover is the question of how God governs and how he treats illegal immigrants in his rule. God doesn't rule a political state, but he is king of all creation, and he makes decisions in his own way that can teach us by their example. In the book of Revelations, we are told that the heavenly Jerusalem has a wall surrounding it with 12 gates in the walls. Heaven has a wall around it, and in order to get inside, one has to pass through one of the gates. In the book of Genesis, God casts the humans from the Garden of Eden and places cherubim at the gates to prevent them from returning. God attaches conditions to being part of his kingdom. He doesn't require people to have a high educational background or working experience, but he does require that they have been washed from their sins and love their neighbor as themselves. It is impossible to enter his kingdom illegally. He does not allow anyone to enter unless they have fulfilled these conditions, and we are told in the gospel that the devil fell from heaven like lightning, which could be read as though God deported him immediately after the devil chose to disobey God. God does not govern in the way of permitting universal migration. Rather, only those who meet his conditions are allowed entry and are allowed to stay. However, those conditions are not out of reach for anyone. Most rich countries place conditions on immigration that can make it very difficult, if not impossible, for many people to enter. Furthermore, they may also use quota systems so that they will only be willing to accept a certain number of people each year. God doesn't work like this, but his conditions are within reach of everyone. And not only this, but he has representatives here on earth who are working hard on his behalf to help people meet those conditions so that they can immigrate and become permanent citizens of his kingdom. He does not set a quota for how many people can enter his kingdom, but there is enough room for everyone. Not everyone will reach it, but that won't be because he is going to cut them off once a certain number has been reached. If we look at God's example, what does it teach us? It is not Lazarus who should be coming to our door to ask for our help, but rather we should be going out to look for Lazarus to bring him into our home. God is trying to get us to immigrate to his country with far more effort than we are trying to get ourselves there. Illegal immigration would still not be permitted because God doesn't allow people into his kingdom without fulfilling his conditions. However, but if rich nations were following his example, they would be trying to find ways for people to legally immigrate, rather than setting up barriers in order to make it difficult for people to get and accept illegally. If rich nations followed this example, then they should perhaps be actively seeking to find the people in the world who can't live in safety in their own countries or who can't find a livelihood in their own countries, and the rich nations should be trying to help these people even more than these people are trying to get help. If they followed God's example, then they wouldn't say that a person needs to reach a certain level of education or work experience to enter in. But the only criteria they would use to decide whether or not someone had a right to come and stay was his own moral character. There is much more that can be said on this topic, but I'll conclude my thoughts here. In the end, we are all hoping to immigrate and become citizens of heaven. Whether or not we get there is going to depend on how we live in this world. If we open our doors to Lazarus and let him in, then heaven's doors will be open to us too. On the other hand, if we refuse to let Lazarus in and keep him at our doorstep, when the time comes, we may find ourselves in the same position, banging on a door that will never open as we suffer and wait outside.